Hello and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. Imagine a man so frail that stronger men shouted him down in debate, yet he shaped the government of the most powerful nation on earth. Picture a scholar who never fired a shot in anger, yet he became commander-in-chief during a war that saw the capital burn to ashes. Consider a Virginian aristocrat who owned slaves while writing the words, "All men are created equal," into the founding documents of a republic. This is the story of James Madison, the father of the Constitution. His life is the story of how ideas become institutions, how philosophy becomes government, how a quiet, sickly student from a Virginia plantation became the architect of American democracy. He was the smallest president in American history, barely 5 feet 4 inches tall and rarely weighing more than 100 pounds. He spoke so softly that those at the back of the room could not hear him. He suffered from mysterious seizures, debilitating illnesses, and a temperament so anxious that public speaking left him physically shaken. And yet, this unlikely figure drafted the blueprint for a government that has endured for more than 2 centuries. He wrote the Bill of Rights. He co-authored the Federalist Papers, the greatest work of political philosophy ever written on American soil. He served as Secretary of State under Thomas Jefferson and as the 4th President of the United States. He navigated the young republic through its most dangerous foreign crisis and lived to see the nation he helped create survive its first 50 years. Before we begin this journey, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It is a simple way to support this work and it means a great deal. I am also curious to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Please leave a comment and tell me your location and what drew you to James Madison's story. And now, settle in. Let the cares of the modern world fall away. Tonight we travel back nearly 3 centuries to a world of candlelit studies and handwritten letters, of plantations and philosophy, of revolution and constitutional debate. We will follow James Madison from a childhood of books and illness, through the founding of a nation and into old age as the last of the founders, the final living link to the extraordinary generation that brought America into being. But before Madison became the father of the Constitution, before he stood in Independence Hall arguing over the shape of a government, before his name was known across the Atlantic, he was simply a sickly boy on a Virginia plantation, reading by firelight, preparing himself for a destiny he could not yet imagine. The Virginia that James Madison was born into in 1751 was not yet American. It was British, proudly so, and it had been for nearly a century and a half. The colony stretched from the Atlantic coast westward into territories that no European had fully mapped. It was a land of stark contrasts. Great plantation houses stood along the rivers, built on the labour of enslaved Africans. Between these estates lay vast forests, small farms worked by free families, and scattered villages where craftsmen and merchants conducted their trade. The Tidewater region, where the Madison family made their home, was the heartland of Virginia's planter aristocracy. Here the great rivers, the James, the York, the Rappahannock and the Potomac flowed down from the Piedmont to the Chesapeake Bay, creating natural highways for the tobacco that was the colony's economic lifeblood. Ships from London, Bristol and Liverpool sailed up these rivers to collect the tobacco hogsheads and deliver the manufactured goods that Virginia's elite could not yet produce themselves. Books, fine furniture, silverware, clothing, all the material markers of civilization came from England. The society was rigidly hierarchical. At the top stood the great planter families, men who owned thousands of acres and hundreds of slaves. These families intermarried, creating a tight network of cousins and in-laws who dominated Virginia's political and economic life. Below them came the smaller planters, men of property but not of great wealth. Then the yeoman farmers who worked their own land with their own hands. Below them, the landless labourers, both free and indentured, and at the very bottom, invisible in law though essential in fact, were the enslaved people whose labour made the entire system possible. The Madison family occupied a position near the top of this hierarchy. They were not among the very greatest families, the Lees or the Carters or the Randolphs, but they were substantial landowners with deep roots in Virginia soil. James Madison Sr., the boy's father, owned about 4,000 acres in Orange County, in the Piedmont region northwest of Richmond. This estate, called Montpelier, sat in rolling country at the foot of the southwest mountains, where the land was fertile and the views stretched for miles. James Madison Sr. was a careful, methodical man who managed his property with skill and attention. He served as a justice of the peace and a vestryman of the local Anglican church, the positions of authority that went with his social station. He was respected in the county, known for his fairness and his business sense. He had married well. His wife, Eleanor Rose Conway, called Nellie, came from one of Virginia's older families. The Conways were connected to the Tidewater elite, bringing social standing that complemented the Madison landholdings. Into this world, on the 16th of March, 1751, James Madison Jr. was born. He was the first child, the eldest son, the heir to Montpelier and all its responsibilities. He was named for his father, as was the custom among Virginia's gentry, a way of binding generations together and asserting the continuity of the family line. The birth took place at his mother's family home on the Rappahannock River, where Eleanor had gone for the delivery. By summer, mother and infant had returned to Montpelier, and the boy's Virginia childhood began. The plantation that would be young James Madison's entire world for his first 18 years was more than just a home. It was an economic enterprise, a small kingdom with its own rhythms and hierarchies. The main house where the family lived was substantial, but not yet the grand mansion it would later become. It was a wooden structure, comfortable but modest by the standards of the greatest Virginia estates. Surrounding it were the dependencies, the kitchen, the smokehouse, the dairy, the storehouses, and further away, the slave quarters where the people who actually worked the land lived in rough wooden cabins. From his earliest years, James would have understood the fundamental reality of his world. Some people were free and some were enslaved. This was not a question but a fact, as basic as the weather. He grew up surrounded by enslaved people. They cooked the family's food, cleaned the house, worked the fields, cared for the children, and built the structures. Their labour made possible the life of learning and leisure that a boy like James would enjoy. This contradiction, freedom built on bondage, would haunt Madison his entire life, though he never found a way to resolve it. But in childhood, these moral complexities were distant. Young James was a bright, curious and fragile child. He was small for his age, prone to illness, and seemed to lack the robust constitution that Virginia's climate and outdoor life demanded. While other boys rode horses, hunted in the forests, and learned the physical skills that plantation life required, James retreated to books. His father, recognizing the boy's intellectual gifts, and perhaps understanding that he would never be a man of physical action, encouraged this bookishness. He secured tutors and built a small library at Montpelier, unusual in a part of Virginia where books were still rare. The boy's illnesses were frequent and mysterious. He suffered from what he called bilious attacks, sudden seizures that left him weak and anxious. These episodes would strike without warning, leaving him prostrate for hours or even days. He described them in later correspondence as resembling epilepsy, though he was always careful not to use that specific word. The social stigma attached to epilepsy was severe, and Madison guarded his privacy about these attacks throughout his life. Modern historians have speculated endlessly about the nature of these afflictions. Perhaps they were true epileptic seizures, absent seizures or complex partial seizures that did not involve the dramatic convulsions typically associated with the condition. Perhaps they were psychosomatic responses to stress and anxiety, the physical manifestation of a sensitive temperament overwhelmed by pressure. Perhaps they were migraines, which can produce neurological symptoms that mimic seizures. Perhaps they were a combination of all these factors. The truth is, we cannot know with certainty, and Madison himself probably did not know. Whatever their cause, they shaped Madison's childhood and his sense of himself profoundly. He learned early that he could not rely on physical strength or presence. While his younger brothers could spend days in the saddle, hunting through the forests or surveying the plantation lands, James had to husband his energy carefully. While other boys wrestled and competed physically, James watched from the margins. This enforced observation taught him to read people, to understand motivations and patterns, to see beneath the surface of social interactions. He learned that he would have to make his way through intelligence and careful preparation. If he could not be the strongest or the most physically impressive, he could be the best informed, the most thoroughly prepared, the one who had read more and thought more deeply than anyone else in the room. This became his strategy for life, a strategy born of necessity, but perfected through decades of practice. The illnesses also made him acutely aware of his own mortality. Unlike his contemporaries who felt invincible in youth, Madison grew up expecting to die young. He wrote in his 20s that he did not expect to live past middle age. This sense of a limited time created urgency, a drive to accomplish what he could while he still had strength. It is one of history's ironies that the founder who was most convinced of his own fragility lived longer than almost any of them, reaching 85 years of age. The world beyond Montpelier was beginning to stir with new ideas, though these reached the Virginia Piedmont slowly and in fragments. In London, Edinburgh, and Paris, philosophers were questioning old certainties about government, religion, and human nature. John Locke had argued that government derived its legitimacy from the consent of the governed, not from divine right. Montesquieu had described how powers could be separated and balanced to prevent tyranny. David Hume was applying reason to questions of religion and morality, challenging traditional authorities. These ideas travelled across the Atlantic in books and pamphlets, finding their way into the libraries of educated planters like James Madison Sr. By the time young James was ready for formal education, his father had decided that he would receive the best schooling available. At age 11, in 1762, James was sent away to board with a Scottish schoolmaster named Donald Robertson, who ran a small school in King and Queen County, about 50 miles from Montpelier. This was young Madison's first extended time away from home, and it marked the beginning of his serious education. Donald Robertson was, by all accounts, an exceptional teacher. He had been educated at the University of Edinburgh during the Scottish Enlightenment's golden age, and he brought to rural Virginia a rigorous curriculum that included Latin, Greek, mathematics, geography, and philosophy. He taught his students to think critically, to question assumptions, to read widely, and argue systematically. For 5 years, from age 11 to 16, James Madison studied under Robertson, absorbing knowledge with an almost desperate intensity. Robertson's school was small, never more than 24 students, and most were sons of Virginia's planter elite. They boarded with Robertson in his modest home in King and Queen County, living simply but studying intensely. The curriculum was demanding. Students rose before dawn for prayers, then spent the morning hours on classical languages. Latin came first, Virgil and Cicero, learning to read the poetry and oratory that had shaped Western civilization. Greek followed, Homer and Herodotus, the foundations of historical and literary tradition. Afternoons were devoted to mathematics and natural philosophy, what we would call science. Robertson taught Euclidean geometry, basic astronomy, the principles of mechanics. He wanted his students to understand the natural world systematically, to see how mathematics could describe physical reality. This was Enlightenment education at its best, combining classical humanism with modern scientific rationality. Evenings were for reading and composition. Students kept commonplace books where they copied out passages from their reading, organized by topic. Madison's commonplace books from these years survive, carefully preserved, and they reveal the range and depth of his study. He copied passages from the Roman historians Livy and Tacitus, learning how republics had risen and fallen. He transcribed political theory, extracts from Montesquieu on the separation of powers, from John Locke on the origins of government. He read English literature, Swift's satire, Addison's essays, learning style and wit along with substance. The boy filled notebooks with carefully transcribed passages from his reading. He studied Virgil and Horace in the original Latin. He read ancient history, focusing particularly on the Greek and Roman republics, learning how democracies had risen and fallen, how liberty had been won and lost. He encountered the Enlightenment writers, Locke and Montesquieu, Swift and Addison. He developed the habit that would define his life: careful study, extensive note-taking, systematic thinking about fundamental questions of government and human nature. Robertson also taught rhetoric and debate. Students were expected to argue both sides of questions, to defend positions they did not necessarily believe. This training in dialectic would serve Madison well in later life, when he had to anticipate opponents' arguments and counter them systematically. He learned that argument was a skill that could be cultivated, that persuasion required understanding your opponent's position as well as your own. But these years away from home also deepened his anxieties. He was small, sickly, socially awkward. Other boys were stronger, more confident, more at ease in the world. Some came from wealthier families, arrived with finer clothes and more spending money. The social hierarchy among the students was as rigid as the hierarchy of Virginia society itself, and Madison, while respectable, was not at the top. He compensated by becoming the best student, the one who always knew the answer, who could cite sources and marshal arguments. He discovered that intellectual mastery could be a kind of power, especially among educated boys who valued learning. If he could not dominate physically or socially, he could dominate academically. His classmates might not like him particularly. He was too serious, too bookish, too intense, but they had to respect his abilities. Robertson recognized Madison's exceptional gifts. He gave the boy access to his private library, which contained works most Virginia students never encountered. He pushed Madison harder than he pushed other students, assigning additional readings, demanding greater precision in argument. He saw in this small, sickly boy from Orange County a first-rate mind, perhaps the best he had ever taught. Years later, after Madison had become famous, Robertson wrote to him expressing pride in his former student's achievements. Madison replied with warmth, crediting Robertson with laying the foundations of whatever he had accomplished. It was a generous acknowledgement, but also an honest one. The 5 years with Donald Robertson had transformed Madison from a curious child into a serious scholar, had given him the tools of analysis and the breadth of learning that would enable everything he later achieved. In 1767, at age 16, Madison returned to Montpelier. He continued his studies at home for 2 years under the Reverend Thomas Martin, an Anglican clergyman who served as tutor and prepared him for college. The question was where to go. Most Virginia gentlemen of Madison's class went to the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, the colony's capital. It was the natural choice, the Virginia choice. But James Madison did not make the natural choice. Instead, in 1769, At age 18, he headed north to New Jersey to attend the College of New Jersey, later known as Princeton. This decision would shape everything that followed. At Princeton, Madison would encounter ideas and people that Virginia could not provide. He would form friendships that would last a lifetime. He would develop the political philosophy that would guide him through revolution and constitution making. He would become, in the fullest sense, an American rather than merely a Virginian. But that transformation lay ahead. For now, in the late summer of 1769, James Madison was simply a nervous, bookish teenager, smaller and frailer than his classmates, heading north to an unfamiliar world, carrying little but his books and his burning desire to prove that a mind could be as powerful as any sword. The College of New Jersey, where James Madison arrived in the autumn of 1769, sat in the small village of Princeton, roughly halfway between New York and Philadelphia. The college was Presbyterian in its origins and its character, founded in 1746 to train ministers and educate young men in the Reformed tradition. It was smaller than Harvard or Yale, but it was gaining a reputation for intellectual rigour and religious fervour that attracted students from throughout the colonies. Nassau Hall, the main building, dominated the landscape. It was an impressive stone structure, 4 stories high, the largest academic building in the colonies when it was completed in 1756. It housed classrooms, a library, a dining hall, and dormitory rooms where students slept 2 or 3 to a chamber. The building itself was a statement of ambition, declaring that this provincial college would be second to none in its physical plant and its educational standards. The college enrolled about 100 students, drawn mainly from the middle colonies in the south, young men from Presbyterian families seeking an education steeped in Calvinist theology and Enlightenment philosophy. Unlike Harvard and Yale, which drew their students primarily from their own regions, Princeton had from its founding been a pan-colonial institution. Students from New Jersey roomed alongside students from Virginia. New Yorkers debated with South Carolinians. This mixing of regional perspectives would prove crucial to Madison's development as a nationalist rather than a narrow Virginia partisan. The daily routine at Princeton was demanding and regimented. Students rose at dawn, often before sunrise in winter, for morning prayers in the chapel. These were not optional. Attendance was compulsory and carefully recorded. President Witherspoon himself often led prayers, using the occasion to set moral and intellectual expectations for the day ahead. After prayers came breakfast in the Commons, simple fare of bread, porridge, and weak beer. The morning hours were devoted to recitations and lectures. Students were assigned passages from classical texts or philosophical works to memorize and be prepared to recite. Professors would call on students randomly to demonstrate their mastery of the material. This was not passive learning but active demonstration, and students who came unprepared faced public humiliation and academic penalties. Madison, with his exceptional memory and his habit of thorough preparation, excelled in these exercises. The president of the college when Madison arrived was John Witherspoon, a Scottish Presbyterian minister who had immigrated to America just 2 years earlier, in 1767. Witherspoon was a formidable figure, a man of both deep faith and wide learning. He stood over 6 feet tall, imposing in an age when most men were shorter. His voice carried authority, and his sermons and lectures were known for their logical rigour and powerful delivery. Witherspoon had studied at the University of Edinburgh during the height of the Scottish Enlightenment, encountering the same currents of thought that had shaped Madison's earlier tutor, Donald Robertson. But Witherspoon combined Enlightenment rationalism with orthodox Calvinism in a way that was distinctly Presbyterian. He believed that reason and revelation need not conflict, that natural law and biblical law pointed in the same direction. He rejected the extreme skepticism of David Hume while embracing Hume's emphasis on empirical observation. He valued science and philosophy while insisting on the truth of Christian revelation. Witherspoon transformed Princeton during his presidency, which would last until his death in 1794. He modernized the curriculum, introducing more mathematics and natural science while maintaining the classical focus on Latin, Greek, and rhetoric. He taught moral philosophy himself, the capstone course that seniors took in their final year. This course covered ethics, politics, and theology, systematically working through the great questions of how humans should live and how societies should be organized. For James Madison, Witherspoon was a revelation. Here was a teacher who took ideas seriously, who showed how philosophical principles could illuminate practical political questions, who believed that educated men had a duty to apply their learning to the great issues of their time. Witherspoon's lectures on moral philosophy were particularly influential. He taught that governments derived their legitimacy from the consent of the governed, a Lockean principle that challenged divine right monarchy. He taught that power corrupted and must be checked through constitutional limits and separation of powers. He taught that religious liberty was essential to a just society, that conscience could not be coerced. Madison absorbed Witherspoon's lectures, filled notebooks with carefully organized notes, and began to develop the systematic approach to political thinking that would characterize his later work. Years later, Madison would credit Witherspoon with shaping his political philosophy more than any other single teacher. The connection between teacher and student was deep and lasting. When Witherspoon later served in the Continental Congress, signing the Declaration of Independence, Madison would count him as an ally and friend. But Madison did more than study. He found friendship, perhaps the deepest friendships of his life, with a small group of classmates who shared his intellectual intensity and his growing political awareness. Chief among these was Philip Freneau, a poet and dreamer who would become one of America's first nationally known literary figures and a fierce advocate for Republican principles. Freneau was everything Madison was not in temperament: romantic, impulsive, passionate, but the two bonded over shared love of literature and shared political convictions. Another close friend was William Bradford of Pennsylvania, the son of a Philadelphia printer. Bradford was steady, thoughtful, less flamboyant than Freneau, but equally committed to Republican ideals. Bradford and Madison would correspond for years after college, exchanging ideas about politics, religion, and philosophy. Their letters reveal young men grappling with fundamental questions about how to live and what kind of society to build. Together, these young men formed a literary and debating society called the American Whig Society, dedicated to the study of rhetoric, politics, and the emerging American identity. The Whigs were conscious of their purpose. They were not just socializing, but preparing themselves for leadership. They read widely, wrote constantly, and debated every question they encountered. They published a small literary journal, contributed satirical pieces mocking their rivals, and took themselves very seriously indeed. The Whigs engaged in fierce debates with a rival society, the Cliosophic Society, arguing questions of governance, liberty, and constitutional law. These debates were not academic exercises, but passionate contests over ideas that mattered. Should America remain tied to Britain or seek independence? Should religious establishments be maintained or abolished? What kind of government could preserve liberty while maintaining order? The questions that would dominate American politics for the next half-century were being debated in Princeton student societies in the early 1770s. Madison learned to argue in these debates, to defend positions, to anticipate objections, to marshal evidence. He was still too nervous to be an effective public speaker in large settings. His voice was too soft, his manner too anxious, his physical presence too slight, but in smaller groups he could be formidable. He learned to express complex ideas clearly, to build arguments logically, to find the weak points in opponents' positions. And on paper, he was devastating. He could write with clarity, precision, and logical force that few of his contemporaries could match. The academic year at Princeton was demanding by design. Students rose at dawn for morning prayers, attended lectures and recitations throughout the day, and were expected to study in their chambers each evening. The college authorities monitored behavior closely. Students were forbidden to drink alcohol, visit taverns, gamble, or engage in any activity considered unworthy of future ministers and leaders. Violations brought punishments ranging from fines to expulsion. Madison drove himself relentlessly, more relentlessly than the college required. He completed the normal 4-year course in just 2 years, graduating in the class of 1771. He did this by studying late into the night, rising before dawn, allowing himself only 5 hours of sleep, pushing his fragile health to its limits. His classmates marveled at his dedication. Some worried that he was destroying himself. They were right to worry. It was too much. After graduation, Madison stayed on at Princeton for additional study in Hebrew and theology, under Witherspoon's direction. He was considering the ministry, or at least his family hoped he was considering it. But truthfully, he was adrift, unsure what to do with his life, convinced that his health would not allow him a long career in any field. By the spring of 1772, he collapsed. The bilious attacks returned with new intensity. He suffered from what he described as a constitutional liability to sudden attacks, somewhat resembling epilepsy. He was convinced that his health was breaking permanently, that he might not live long. He returned to Montpelier in a state of deep depression and physical exhaustion, a brilliant young man who seemed to have used himself up at age 21. For the next 2 years, from 1772 to 1774, Madison lived quietly at his father's plantation, reading, corresponding with his Princeton friends, and slowly recovering his strength. These were the lost years, a period when he seemed directionless, unable to decide on a profession or a path forward. He was too frail for the law, which required courtroom advocacy and public speaking. He was too intellectually restless for the Anglican ministry, and his exposure to Princeton's Presbyterianism had left him skeptical of established churches. He thought vaguely about becoming a planter like his father, but he lacked enthusiasm for the practical work of agriculture. But while Madison struggled with personal uncertainty, the world around him was moving toward crisis. In 1773, colonists in Boston dumped British tea into the harbour to protest taxation without representation. In 1774, Britain responded with the Coercive Acts, closing Boston Harbour and tightening control over Massachusetts. Virginia's House of Burgesses protested these measures and called for a Continental Congress to coordinate colonial resistance. The conflict that would become the American Revolution was beginning. Madison followed these events closely, reading newspapers, exchanging letters with Bradford in Pennsylvania, and discussing politics with his father and neighbours. In his correspondence with Bradford, Madison revealed growing outrage at religious intolerance. Virginia, unlike Pennsylvania, had an established church, the Anglican Church, and dissenters, particularly Baptists, faced persecution. Baptist preachers were being jailed for preaching without a license from the Anglican authorities. Madison, whose time at Presbyterian Princeton had taught him the value of religious diversity, was appalled. In a letter to Bradford in January 1774, Madison wrote with unusual passion, "That diabolical, hell-conceived principle of persecution rages among some, and to their eternal infamy the clergy can furnish their quota of imps for such business." This was strong language from a young man not yet 23, and it revealed the direction his thinking was taking. He was becoming convinced that religious liberty, the freedom of conscience, was fundamental to any just society. This conviction would later shape his work on the Bill of Rights. But for now he remained at Montpelier, uncertain of his future, convinced his health would never allow him to play a significant public role. He had no way of knowing that within 2 years he would be serving in Virginia's revolutionary government, or that within 15 years he would be standing in Philadelphia drafting a constitution that would endure for centuries. The great work of his life was approaching, but it came to him not through ambition or planning, but through the accidents of revolution and the urgent need for men who could think clearly in a time of chaos. In April of 1775, shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. The revolution had begun, and James Madison, the anxious, sickly student from Orange County, found himself called to serve a cause that would give meaning to all his years of study and all his carefully accumulated knowledge of history, philosophy, and the arts of government. The revolution came to Virginia more slowly than it came to Massachusetts, but it came with equal force. In the spring of 1775, Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, seized the colony's gunpowder from the public magazine in Williamsburg, hoping to disarm potential rebels. The response was swift and furious. Militia companies formed across the colony. In Orange County, James Madison's father served on the Committee of Safety, the local revolutionary government. The younger Madison, though still battling his mysterious illnesses, joined the local militia as a volunteer. It was a brief and inglorious military career. Madison drilled with his neighbours, learned to march and handle a musket, and discovered that he was utterly unsuited for military life. He lacked the physical stamina for long marches, the commanding presence for leadership, and the aggressive temperament for combat. He never saw action, never fired a shot in anger, but the experience taught him something important about himself and about the revolution. America needed soldiers, yes, but it also needed thinkers, organisers, men who could draft laws and build institutions. Madison would serve the revolution with his mind, not with a musket. In April of 1776, Virginia called a convention to write a new state constitution. Madison, not quite 25 years old, was elected as a delegate from Orange County. It was his first political office, and it brought him to Williamsburg, the colonial capital, where Virginia's political elite was gathering to create a new government free from British rule. The Virginia Convention of 1776 was an extraordinary assembly. It included George Mason, the author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, Patrick Henry, the fiery orator who had declared, "Give me liberty or give me death," and many of Virginia's most experienced political leaders. Among these men, Madison was a nobody, a young, inexperienced delegate from an inland county, too nervous to speak effectively in large assemblies. But he found ways to make himself useful. He served on committees, drafted language, worked behind the scenes. When George Mason presented his draft of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, Madison proposed a crucial amendment. Mason's draft had called for religious toleration, the idea that established churches should tolerate dissenters. Madison argued for something more radical, full religious liberty, the idea that all people should be free to worship according to their conscience, with no established church at all. The convention ultimately adopted language that moved in Madison's direction, though it stopped short of fully disestablishing the Anglican Church. This was Madison's first significant contribution to American constitutional thought, and it revealed the pattern he would follow throughout his career. He was not an orator who could sway crowds with passionate speeches. He was a careful thinker who could draft precise language, who could see the implications of seemingly small word choices, who could turn philosophical principles into legal text. He worked best in small groups, in committees, in the detailed work of drafting and revising. This was where his Princeton education paid dividends. He could think systematically about institutions, could draw on his reading in history and political theory, could craft language that would endure. In July 1776, news reached Williamsburg that the Continental Congress in Philadelphia had declared independence. Virginia's delegates had voted for the measure. The revolution was now total. There would be no reconciliation with Britain, no return to the old colonial status. The Americans would be independent or they would be crushed. For the next several years, as war raged from New England to the Carolinas, Madison served in Virginia's government. He was elected to the House of Delegates, Virginia's new legislature, in 1776. But he lost his seat in 1777 because he refused to provide the customary free whiskey to voters. This was his first lesson in practical politics. Principle was admirable, but elections required understanding human nature. The voters of Orange County liked their whiskey more than they liked a young man's scruples, but this setback proved fortunate. The legislature appointed Madison to Virginia's Council of State, an advisory body to the governor. The governor was Thomas Jefferson, and Madison's service on the council brought him into close contact with the man who had become his most important political partner. Jefferson, 14 years older than Madison, was already famous for writing the Declaration of Independence. He was tall, eloquent, aristocratic, everything Madison was not. But he recognized in the younger man a kindred spirit, a fellow student of Enlightenment philosophy, a careful thinker who shared his Republican principles. Jefferson and Madison formed a friendship that would last 50 years and shape American history. They were different in temperament. Jefferson was optimistic, visionary, sometimes impractical. Madison was cautious, systematic, attentive to detail. Jefferson was bold in imagination, but often reluctant to engage in political combat. Madison was quiet in manner, but tenacious in argument. Together they complemented each other perfectly. Jefferson would provide the soaring vision, Madison the careful architecture. Jefferson would inspire, Madison would execute. In 1780, at age 29, Madison was elected to the Continental Congress, America's national government during the Revolutionary War. He travelled to Philadelphia, then to other cities as Congress moved to escape British armies, and he served for 3 years as one of Virginia's delegates. These were crucial years for his development as a political thinker. He encountered delegates from all 13 states, learned their different interests and concerns, and began to understand the weaknesses of the existing system of government. The Continental Congress operated under the Articles of Confederation, America's first constitution. But the Articles created a very weak national government. Congress could request money from the states, but it could not tax. It could make treaties, but it could not enforce them. It had no executive branch to carry out its decisions, and no judicial branch to settle disputes. Each state retained its sovereignty, and the national government was little more than a league of friendship among independent republics. Madison saw the problems immediately. The states refused to pay their requisitions, leaving the national government bankrupt. They erected trade barriers against each other, creating economic chaos. They ignored treaties that Congress had signed. They raised their own armies and conducted their own foreign policies. The Confederation was dissolving into 13 separate countries, weak and quarrelsome, prey to European powers that were waiting for the American experiment to fail. During his years in Congress, Madison filled notebook after notebook with careful analysis of confederacies throughout history. He studied the Amphictyonic League of ancient Greece, the Achaean League, the Germanic Confederation, the Swiss cantons. He read about how these confederacies had functioned, how they had failed, What had caused their collapse? He was searching for patterns, for principles that could guide the creation of a more effective American government. He became convinced that the fundamental problem was the Article's reliance on state sovereignty. A true national government needed the power to act directly on individuals, not merely on states. It needed the power to tax, to regulate commerce, to enforce its laws. It needed separate legislative, executive, and judicial branches, each checking and balancing the others. These ideas, formed during his congressional years, would become the foundation of the Constitution he would later draft. But in the early 1780s, these were just ideas in Madison's notebooks. The war was still being fought. In 1781, British armies rampaged through Virginia, burning and plundering. Madison's own county was threatened. Montpelier itself narrowly escaped destruction. Then, in October 1781, came the stunning news. Washington had trapped Cornwallis at Yorktown. The British had surrendered. The war was effectively over. Peace brought new problems. British armies left, but they left behind economic chaos, political divisions, and fundamental questions about what kind of nation America would become. Madison returned to Virginia in 1783, his 3-year term in Congress complete. He was 32 years old, unmarried, still living at Montpelier, still uncertain about his personal future, even as his political ideas crystallized. For the next 3 years, from 1783 to 1786, Madison served again in Virginia's House of Delegates. He pushed for religious liberty, working with Jefferson to pass the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, one of the founding documents of American church-state separation. He worked to reform Virginia's legal code, to establish public education, to improve navigation on Virginia's rivers. He was building a reputation as one of Virginia's most effective legislators, a man who understood both principle and practice. But he was increasingly convinced that Virginia's problems were national problems, that no state could prosper while the national government remained weak and ineffective. Trade was disrupted, debts were unpaid, Western lands were under threat from Spain and Britain, and the states were drifting apart. Something had to be done, and Madison was preparing himself to do it. In 1786, a convention met at Annapolis to discuss commercial problems among the states. Only 5 states sent delegates, too few to accomplish anything. But Madison, working with Alexander Hamilton of New York, saw an opportunity. The Annapolis delegates issued a call for a broader convention to meet in Philadelphia in May 1787 to consider amendments to the Articles of Confederation. Congress, desperate for solutions, endorsed the call. James Madison prepared for the Philadelphia Convention with characteristic thoroughness. He spent months studying, reading, and thinking. He wrote what would later be called The Vices of the Political System of the United States, a systematic analysis of everything wrong with the Articles of Confederation. He drafted an outline for a completely new constitution, not just amendments, but a fundamental restructuring of American government. When he arrived in Philadelphia in early May 1787, 11 days before the convention was scheduled to begin, he was ready. He carried with him a plan, worked out in detail, for how to save the American Republic from dissolution. He had no way of knowing that over the next 4 months he would transform those notes and ideas into the Constitution of the United States. But he also had no way of knowing the opposition he would face, the compromises he would have to accept, the exhausting battles that lay ahead. The Constitutional Convention would be the greatest test of James Madison's life, and it would establish his claim to be remembered as the father of the Constitution. The State House in Philadelphia, where the Constitutional Convention met from May to September of 1787, was already a sacred space in American memory. It was here, in this same building, that the Continental Congress had declared independence 11 years earlier. Now a new generation of leaders gathered to complete the work that Declaration had begun, to create a government worthy of a free people. 55 delegates from 12 states would eventually attend. Rhode Island, suspicious of any strengthening of national power, refused to send anyone. The delegates included many of the most distinguished men in America. George Washington, the hero of the Revolution, came out of retirement to serve as the convention's president. Benjamin Franklin, 81 years old and suffering from gout, was carried to the sessions in a sedan chair. Alexander Hamilton represented New York, though his state's other delegates would oppose almost everything he proposed. But the delegate who mattered most, the one who would shape the proceedings more than any other, was James Madison of Virginia. He arrived early and he came prepared. While other delegates were still travelling to Philadelphia, Madison was meeting with the Virginia delegation, sharing his plan, building support. By the time the convention officially opened on May 25th, the Virginia plan, largely Madison's work, was ready to be presented. The Virginia plan was radical. It proposed scrapping the Articles of Confederation entirely and creating a wholly new national government. This government would have 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial, each independent but each able to check the others. The legislature would be bicameral, with 2 houses. Both houses would be apportioned by population, giving larger states more representation. The national government would have power to legislate in all cases where the states were incompetent, to veto state laws, to use force against states that refused to obey national law. This was not a confederation of sovereign states. This was a national government with real power, a government that could act directly on individuals, that could tax, regulate commerce, raise armies, and enforce its will. It was everything the Articles of Confederation was not, and it provoked immediate controversy. For the next 4 months, from late May to mid-September, the delegates argued. They debated every aspect of the Virginia plan. How should the legislature be apportioned? Should slaves be counted for purposes of representation? Should there be one executive or several? How should the executive be chosen? What powers should the national government have? How could state sovereignty be preserved while creating effective national authority? The debates were fierce, the disagreements profound. Large states and small states clashed over representation in what became known as the Great Compromise or Connecticut Compromise. Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts wanted representation based purely on population, which would give them dominant influence. Delaware, New Jersey, and Connecticut insisted on equal representation for each state, preserving the Confederation principle that had existed under the Articles. The battle over representation consumed weeks. Madison spoke repeatedly, arguing that proportional representation was the only just basis for a republic. How could Delaware, with 60,000 people, have the same voice as Virginia with 750,000? It violated every principle of republican government, where power should flow from the people. The small states countered that equal representation was necessary to protect them from being swallowed by larger neighbours, that states as political entities had rights that must be preserved. The compromise that eventually emerged gave proportional representation in the House of Representatives but equal representation in the Senate, with each state having 2 senators regardless of size. Madison opposed this compromise vehemently. He thought it violated the principle of proportional representation and gave too much power to small states. He warned that it would create gridlock, that the small states would use their Senate power to block measures supported by the majority of Americans. But he was overruled. The small states would not accept the Constitution without this concession, and the large states finally agreed to it rather than see the convention collapse. the question of slavery produced some of the convention's most difficult and morally troubling moments. The delegates from South Carolina and Georgia, states where enslaved people made up 40% or more of the population, insisted that any constitution must protect the slave trade and count slaves for purposes of representation. They were blunt about this. If the Constitution threatened slavery, the Deep South would reject it and might not even remain in the Union. Northern delegates found these demands morally repugnant. Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania delivered one of the convention's most passionate speeches, calling slavery a nefarious institution that cursed the states where it prevailed. He argued that it was unconscionable to count slaves for representation when they had no rights, when they were treated as property. He predicted that slavery would eventually destroy the Union if it was not addressed. But the Northern delegates were also practical. They knew that without the Deep South there would be no Constitution, no Union, and probably no path forward for the American experiment. The result was a series of compromises that never once used the word slavery, but that clearly protected the institution. Slaves would count as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation and direct taxation. The international slave trade could not be banned by Congress until 1808, giving the Deep South 20 more years to import enslaved Africans. Fugitive slaves would have to be returned to their owners, with no refuge in free states. Madison participated in these debates uneasily. He owned slaves, about 100 people worked his plantation, and he had been raised in a slave society where the institution was taken for granted. He shared the racial assumptions of his time and place, believing that Africans were inferior to Europeans, though he also believed that slavery itself had degraded the enslaved population and that free blacks could, over time and with education, rise to equality. But Madison also recognized slavery as a moral wrong and a political danger. In one of the convention's most famous speeches, he identified slavery as the fundamental division in American society, more profound than the division between large and small states. He predicted that conflicts over slavery would dominate future politics, that they would shape party alignments and threaten the Union. He was right, though it would take 70 years for the conflict to explode into civil war. Yet at the convention, Madison accepted the compromises on slavery as necessary to create a union. Without them, there would be no constitution, no federal government, and probably no eventual path to ending slavery. This was Madison's tragedy, and America's, the original sin built into the founding, the price paid for unity. Madison would later call slavery the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man, but he never freed his own slaves, and he helped write a constitution that protected the institution for at least 2 more decades. The debates over the executive branch were equally contentious. Should there be one president or an executive council? How long should the president serve? Should there be term limits? How should the president be chosen by the legislature, by the people directly, by some intermediate body? What powers should the president have, particularly over war and foreign policy? Madison initially favoured selection of the president by the legislature, fearing that direct popular election would give too much power to demagogues who could manipulate public opinion. But he was persuaded by the arguments of James Wilson and Gouverneur Morris that legislative selection would make the executive too dependent on Congress, violating the separation of powers. The solution was the Electoral College, an intermediate body that would make the choice based on the votes of electors chosen by each state. The Electoral College was a compromise, like so much of the Constitution. It reflected the framers' distrust of pure democracy, but also their desire to base government on popular will. It gave states power in presidential selection, while ensuring that smaller states would not be completely overshadowed. It was complex, perhaps unnecessarily so, and it would create problems that persist to this day. By early September, a draft constitution was complete. A committee of style, led by Gouverneur Morris, polished the language. Morris was a brilliant writer, and he transformed the committee's dry legal prose into something more eloquent. He was responsible for the Constitution's famous opening, "We the People of the United States," which replaced the committee's original listing of the 13 states. That simple change was profound. It asserted that the Constitution came from the people themselves, not from the states, establishing the basis for national sovereignty. On September 17th, 1787, the delegates gathered for the final vote. Not everyone was satisfied. George Mason of Virginia, author of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, refused to sign because there was no Bill of Rights. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts refused to sign because he thought the document gave too much power to the national government. Edmund Randolph of Virginia, who had introduced Madison's Virginia Plan at the start of the convention, also refused to sign, fearing that the Constitution would be rejected and that Virginia would be blamed for proposing it. But 39 of the 42 delegates still present signed the document. Benjamin Franklin, carried into the hall in his sedan chair, signed despite reservations. He had prepared a speech urging unanimous support, noting that he had doubts about parts of the Constitution, but that he doubted his own infallibility. Any convention of fallible men would produce an imperfect document. The question was whether this imperfect constitution was better than no constitution at all. His speech, read aloud by James Wilson because Franklin was too weak to deliver it himself, swayed some of the reluctant delegates. Madison signed, though he was not entirely happy with the result. The Constitution was less national than he had wanted, more accommodating of state sovereignty than he thought wise, and without the veto power over state laws that he considered essential to preventing states from undermining the national government. The equal representation of states in the Senate troubled him deeply, as did the compromises on slavery. But the Constitution created a government with real power, with a structure designed to prevent tyranny, with mechanisms for amendment and evolution. It was infinitely better than the Articles of Confederation, and it might, with luck and wisdom, endure. As the delegates left Philadelphia, they knew their work was not done. The Constitution now had to be ratified by at least 9 of the 13 states, and many Americans were deeply suspicious of this new, powerful national government. The hardest battle was yet to come. James Madison returned to Virginia in late September 1787, carrying copies of the proposed Constitution and knowing that the fight for ratification would be bitter. The document was already generating fierce opposition. Critics, who called themselves anti-federalists, argued that the Constitution created a government too strong, too distant from the people, too likely to become tyrannical. They wanted to preserve state sovereignty and individual liberty against this new federal power. Madison, along with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, decided to make the case for ratification in a series of newspaper essays. Writing under the pseudonym Publius, they produced 85 essays between October 1787 and August 1788, published first in New York newspapers and then collected as the Federalist Papers. These essays remain the greatest work of political philosophy written in America, a profound exploration of the principles of republican government. Madison wrote 29 of the essays, including the most important ones. Federalist number 10 explained how a large republic could control the dangers of faction better than a small one. Federalist number 51 described how ambition could be made to counteract ambition through the separation of powers. Federalist number 39 through number 46 systematically defended each aspect of the Constitution against anti-federalist objections. The essays revealed Madison's political philosophy in its mature form. He believed that humans were capable of reason and self-government, but he also believed they were driven by passion and self-interest. The challenge was to design institutions that could channel these competing interests toward the common good, that could prevent any faction from dominating, that could preserve liberty while maintaining order. The Constitution's system of checks and balances, its division of power between national and state governments, its bicameral legislature, all served this purpose. But publishing essays was not enough. The real battle would be fought in state ratifying conventions, and Virginia's convention would be crucial. If Virginia, the largest and most influential state, rejected the Constitution, the entire plan might collapse. Madison secured election as a delegate to Virginia's ratifying convention, which met in Richmond in June 1788. The opposition was formidable. Patrick Henry, Virginia's greatest orator, led the anti-Federalists. He argued for 3 weeks against the Constitution, warning that it would destroy state sovereignty, create a monarchy in all but name, and threaten the liberty that Americans had fought a revolution to secure. Henry's speeches were magnificent, passionate, and terrifying. He painted vivid pictures of federal tax collectors descending on Virginia, of standing armies crushing state militias, of distant rulers trampling on local rights. Madison had to respond, and this meant speaking in public, the thing he feared most. But he forced himself to stand and argue day after day. His voice was so soft that people in the back of the hall could not hear him. He lacked Henry's drama and eloquence, but he had logic, evidence, and a systematic understanding of how governments actually worked. He took Henry's fears apart piece by piece, showing how the Constitution's structure would prevent the tyrannies Henry predicted. The debates went on for weeks. It was June, and Richmond was sweltering. The delegates argued through the heat, tempers fraying, votes uncertain. Madison's health suffered. He was exhausted, anxious, suffering from his old bilious attacks. But he kept arguing, kept explaining, kept holding the Federalist coalition together. The turning point came when Madison promised that if Virginia ratified the Constitution, he would work to add a Bill of Rights, a series of amendments protecting individual liberties. Many delegates who feared the new government's power were reassured by this promise. On June 25, 1788, Virginia voted to ratify, 89 to 79. It was close, but it was enough. By this time, 9 states had already ratified, the number required to make the Constitution operational. But Virginia's approval, followed quickly by New York's, gave the new government legitimacy. The Constitution would take effect. The United States of America would have a real government at last. Madison had won the greatest political battle of his life, but he had made a promise, and now he had to keep it. He had promised amendments to protect individual rights. The man who had initially thought a Bill of Rights unnecessary would now become its primary author. In the spring of 1789, James Madison was elected to the first House of Representatives under the new Constitution. He arrived in New York, the temporary capital, in March, one of the first members to take his seat. The new government was just beginning. George Washington had not yet been inaugurated as president. The Senate had not yet achieved a quorum. Everything was uncertain, experimental. Madison quickly became the most important member of the House. He drafted Washington's inaugural address. He drafted the House's reply to that address. He led the effort to create executive departments and define their powers. He argued for how the president should be addressed, simple titles, not royal ones. He worked on tariff bills to raise revenue. He was everywhere, shaping the new government through its first uncertain months. But his most important work was keeping his promise to add a Bill of Rights. Anti-Federalists were demanding a second constitutional convention to limit federal power. Madison opposed this. He thought amendments should be proposed by Congress and ratified by the states according to the process outlined in the Constitution itself. This would allow careful, limited changes rather than wholesale revision. In June 1789, Madison introduced a series of proposed amendments to the House. He had distilled down the hundreds of amendments suggested by various state ratifying conventions, eliminating redundancies and focusing on the most essential protections. His proposals protected freedom of religion, speech, and press. They guaranteed the right to bear arms, the right to jury trial, and protection against unreasonable searches and self-incrimination. They reserved to the states and the people all powers not delegated to the federal government. Some Federalists thought the amendments unnecessary. Some anti-Federalists thought they did not go far enough. But Madison pushed them through, revising language, building coalitions, making the case that these amendments would secure public confidence in the new government without weakening its essential powers. By September, Congress had approved 12 amendments and sent them to the states for ratification. 10 of these would be ratified by December 1791, becoming the Bill of Rights. Madison had now completed the constitutional work that would define his legacy. He had drafted the Constitution's basic framework. He had defended it in the Federalist Papers and at Virginia's ratifying convention. And he had written the Bill of Rights that protected individual liberty against government overreach. At age 40, James Madison had done more to shape American constitutional government than any other person except perhaps Washington himself. But his political career was far from over. In fact, some of his most difficult and controversial years lay ahead. For Madison was about to face a challenge that would test everything he believed about governance, loyalty, and the meaning of the Constitution he had written. The challenge came from his closest ally. In 1790, Alexander Hamilton, serving as Secretary of the Treasury in Washington's administration, proposed a series of measures to put the new nation's finances on solid footing. He wanted the federal government to assume all state debts from the Revolutionary War. He wanted to create a national bank. He wanted to promote manufacturing through protective tariffs. Hamilton's vision was of a powerful commercial republic led by a strong national government promoting economic development. Madison opposed these measures. He thought Hamilton's plan violated the Constitution by expanding federal power beyond what the document permitted. He thought it favoured northern commercial interests over southern agricultural ones. He thought the national bank was unconstitutional because the Constitution did not explicitly grant Congress power to create one. Most fundamentally, he feared that Hamilton was trying to create the kind of centralised government that Madison had fought to prevent. The disagreement between Madison and Hamilton shattered the Federalist coalition that had won ratification of the Constitution. It created America's first political parties. Hamilton's supporters called themselves Federalists. They favoured strong national government and commercial development. Madison, working increasingly closely with Thomas Jefferson, led the opposition, the Democratic Republicans, who favoured strict interpretation of the Constitution and protection of agricultural interests and state rights. The party conflict grew increasingly bitter through the 1790s. When war broke out between Britain and revolutionary France in 1793, the parties divided over foreign policy as well. Federalists favoured Britain, America's trading partner and cultural parent. Democratic Republicans favoured France, America's revolutionary ally and fellow republic. Washington tried to maintain neutrality, but the partisan divisions made governing increasingly difficult. Madison, serving in the House through Washington's presidency, became the leader of the opposition. He opposed Jay's treaty with Britain in 1795, arguing it was too favourable to British interests. He opposed Federalist efforts to strengthen the executive branch. He increasingly believed that the Federalists were betraying the principles of the Revolution, creating a government too powerful, too favourable to the wealthy. too similar to the British system Americans had fought to escape. In 1797, Madison retired from the House. He was 46 years old, tired of political combat, ready to return to Montpelier and private life. He had served continuously in public office since 1776, more than 20 years. He wanted rest, and he wanted to focus on his new wife. In 1794, at age 43, Madison had finally married. His bride was Dolly Payne Todd, a young widow from Philadelphia. Dolly was everything Madison was not: vivacious, socially graceful, comfortable in crowds. She was also 17 years younger than her husband. The marriage was, by all accounts, happy. Dolly gave Madison a warmth and social ease he had always lacked. She loved Montpelier and the role of plantation mistress. Madison had found a partner who could compensate for his social awkwardness and manage the public aspects of life that he found exhausting. But Madison's retirement did not last long. In 1798, the Federalist-controlled Congress, reacting to fears of French radicalism and domestic subversion, passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. These laws gave the president power to deport foreigners, extended the residency requirement for citizenship, and criminalized criticism of the federal government. Federalist prosecutors used the Sedition Act to arrest and imprison Republican newspaper editors and politicians. Madison was horrified. The Sedition Act violated the First Amendment he had written. It was precisely the kind of tyranny that the Bill of Rights was supposed to prevent. Working secretly with Jefferson, Madison drafted the Virginia Resolutions, adopted by Virginia's legislature in December 1798. These resolutions declared the Alien and Sedition Acts unconstitutional and argued that states had the right to interpose their authority to protect their citizens from unconstitutional federal laws. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, as they became known when Kentucky adopted similar measures drafted by Jefferson, would have a complicated legacy. They established the principle that unconstitutional laws are void. But they also contributed to later theories of state nullification and secession that would nearly destroy the Union in the 1860s. Madison spent much of his later life trying to explain that his resolutions had not advocated secession or disunion, only a right of states to protest unconstitutional acts. It was one of the few aspects of his political career he came to regret. But in 1798, Madison was simply fighting for what he saw as fundamental constitutional principles against a government that had become tyrannical. The fight would continue until the election of 1800, when Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams to become president. Jefferson's victory was, in Madison's view, the restoration of Republican principles and the repudiation of Federalist excess. And when Jefferson became president in 1801, he asked his closest friend to serve as Secretary of State. Madison agreed. At age 50, he was about to enter the most active and controversial phase of his political career. James Madison served as Secretary of State for all 8 years of Thomas Jefferson's presidency, from 1801 to 1809. These were years of both triumph and crisis, as the young republic tried to maintain its independence, while European powers, Britain and France, waged total war against each other. Madison's main task was conducting American foreign policy, and that meant primarily managing relations with Britain and France. Both powers were violating American neutral rights, seizing American ships, impressing American sailors, and treating the United States with contempt. The British were worse. They maintained military posts on American territory, they armed Indians to resist American expansion in the Northwest, and their navy stopped American ships on the high seas and forced American sailors into British service. Jefferson and Madison tried economic pressure. If Britain and France would not respect American rights, America would stop trading with them. In 1807, Congress passed the Embargo Act, prohibiting all American ships from sailing to foreign ports. The theory was that Britain and France needed American trade more than America needed theirs. The reality was disaster. American merchants went bankrupt, ships rotted at their docks, sailors lost their livelihoods, and smuggling became rampant. Neither Britain nor France changed its policies. The embargo accomplished nothing except economic suffering. Madison defended the embargo as necessary to avoid war, but even he recognized it was failing. In 1809, as Jefferson's presidency ended, Congress replaced the embargo with the Non-Intercourse Act, allowing trade with all nations except Britain and France. It was a retreat, an admission that economic coercion had not worked, and in 1809, Madison himself became president. He had won the election easily, the natural successor to Jefferson, the last of the Virginia dynasty's second generation. At his inauguration in March 1809, he was 57 years old, small, frail, still fighting his mysterious illnesses. He wore a suit of American-made wool to demonstrate Republican simplicity, and his wife Dolly, in her silk dress and turban, outshone him completely. Even as president, Madison's physical presence was not imposing. But he brought to the presidency unmatched experience in constitutional government and deep knowledge of foreign affairs. He also brought the same principles that had guided him since his Princeton days: belief in limited government, strict construction of the Constitution, protection of individual rights, and above all, the conviction that the American Republic must preserve its independence and its republican character against European corruption and tyranny. What he did not bring was the ability to manage people or the political skills to unite a fractious party. Madison was a brilliant constitutional theorist, but he was not a particularly effective executive. His cabinet included men who were incompetent, corrupt, or disloyal. His secretaries of war and navy were disasters. His first Secretary of State, Robert Smith, actively worked against his policies. Madison eventually fired Smith and replaced him with James Monroe, but the damage was done. He appeared weak, unable to control his own administration, and the foreign policy crisis only worsened. Britain continued to impress American sailors, seize American ships, and arm Indians on the frontier. A new generation of congressmen, the War Hawks, led by Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, demanded action. They wanted war with Britain to defend American honor, seize Canada, and stop Indian attacks on the frontier. Madison tried to avoid war. He was not a warrior. He had never fired a shot in combat. He knew that America was unprepared for war, that the army was small and poorly trained, that the navy was tiny compared to Britain's, that the nation was divided and many New Englanders would oppose fighting their best trading partner. But by 1812, he had run out of options. Economic pressure had failed. Diplomacy had failed. Britain showed no sign of changing its policies. On June 1st, 1812, Madison sent a message to Congress asking for a declaration of war. He listed American grievances, impressment of seamen, violation of neutral rights, incitement of Indian attacks. Congress debated for 2 weeks, then voted for war. The vote was close, especially in the Senate, revealing how divided the nation was. But America was now at war with the greatest power on earth. The War of 1812 began badly and got worse. American invasions of Canada, the primary war aim of the War Hawks who had pushed for conflict, failed miserably across all fronts. General William Hull, commanding American forces in the Northwest, surrendered Detroit to a smaller British and Indian force in August 1812 without firing a shot. Hull was terrified by British General Isaac Brock's psychological warfare, including warnings about the ferocity of Indian warriors if Detroit fell by assault. Hull's surrender left the entire Michigan Territory in British hands and exposed Ohio and Indiana to attack. The invasion from New York fared no better. In October 1812, American forces crossed the Niagara River at Queenston Heights, briefly capturing the British position. But New York militia on the American side of the river refused to cross and support the regulars, claiming their constitutional obligation was only to defend American territory. Outnumbered and unsupported, the American regulars were forced to surrender. General Stephen Van Rensselaer, the American commander, was so humiliated that he resigned his commission. A third invasion force, commanded by General Henry Dearborn, marched north from Plattsburgh toward Montreal, but turned back at the Canadian border when militia units refused to continue. The campaign achieved nothing. The pattern was established: ambitious plans, inadequate execution, militia unreliability, and British resistance stronger than American planners had anticipated. The problem was systemic and deeply rooted. The American army numbered fewer than 10,000 men when war was declared, and most were scattered across frontier posts from New England to Louisiana. The War Department under Secretary William Eustis was chaotic, unable to organize supply lines, coordinate movements between different commands, or even maintain accurate rosters of troops and officers. Supplies that should have gone to Detroit went to Niagara. Troops assembled at rendezvous points only to find no food, no tents, no ammunition. Officers were often political appointees with no military experience beyond militia service. Many of the general officers were veterans of the Revolution, but that meant they were in their 60s or 70s, too old for active campaigning. They moved slowly, thought conservatively, and could not adapt to changed circumstances. The younger officers often lacked training. West Point was still small and had graduated only a few dozen officers. Leadership was a persistent problem throughout the war's first 2 years. The state militias, on which American war planning relied heavily, proved unreliable in the extreme. Some militia units fought bravely when defending their home states, but they frequently refused to cross state lines or invade foreign territory, citing constitutional restrictions on their service. They were also poorly trained, rarely drilled together, and usually lacked proper equipment. When confronted by British regulars or even by Indian warriors, militia units often broke and ran, leaving regular army units to be overrun. The tiny American Navy won some stunning single-ship victories that boosted national morale in an otherwise discouraging war. The frigate USS Constitution defeated HMS Guerriere in August 1812, earning the nickname Old Ironsides, when British cannonballs seemed to bounce harmlessly off her thick oak hull. The Constitution later defeated HMS Java. The United States captured HMS Macedonian. These victories humiliated the Royal Navy, which had not lost single-ship actions in decades, and proved that American ships and sailors were equal to any in the world. But these glorious victories, however much they lifted American spirits, could not break the British blockade that was strangling American commerce. Britain's Royal Navy numbered over 600 ships, including more than 100 ships of the line and scores of frigates. America had fewer than 20 ocean-going warships. By 1813, British squadrons had established a tight blockade of every major American port from New England to the Gulf of Mexico. American merchant ships stayed in harbour, American exports dried up, and American customs revenue, the federal government's primary source of income, collapsed. The economic consequences were severe and immediate. Merchants who had grown wealthy on international trade went bankrupt by the hundreds. Ships rotted at their docks, their owners unable to pay for maintenance or crews. Sailors, unable to find work at sea, crowded into port cities looking for any employment. Prices rose sharply as imported goods became scarce. Items that had been common, coffee, tea, manufactured cloth, became luxuries. Some regions suffered more than others. New England, heavily dependent on maritime trade, was devastated. The South and West, more agricultural and self-sufficient, felt less immediate pain, but still suffered from inability to export their crops. The federal government faced a fiscal crisis. With customs revenue cut off, the Treasury could not pay for the war it was fighting. Congress authorized loans, but banks were reluctant to lend to a government that might lose the war. Interest rates on government bonds rose sharply. The government had to offer increasingly unfavorable terms to attract lenders. By 1814, the Treasury was on the verge of bankruptcy, unable to pay troops or purchase supplies. The financial strain intensified political opposition to the war. New England Federalists, who had opposed the war from its declaration, grew increasingly vocal and increasingly dangerous to national unity. They called it Mr. Madison's War, a partisan conflict waged by Southern and Western Republicans for territorial expansion and political advantage. Federalist newspapers published vicious attacks on Madison personally, calling him weak, incompetent, a tool of Napoleon. Some Federalist politicians talked openly of secession, of New England withdrawing from the Union and making a separate peace with Britain. In late 1814, as British armies were advancing on multiple fronts and Washington lay in ashes, Federalist delegates from the New England states met in Hartford, Connecticut, to consider their response to the crisis. The Hartford Convention, as it became known, debated whether New England should secede from the Union. Moderate voices prevailed, but the convention issued a report demanding constitutional amendments that would limit federal power, require a two-thirds vote in Congress to declare war or admit new states, limit embargoes to 60 days, and prohibit naturalized citizens from holding federal office. The demands revealed how fragmented the Union had become, how close to dissolution. Madison's popularity plummeted to levels not seen since John Adams's presidency. Political cartoons depicted him as a tiny, weak figure, buffeted by forces beyond his control. Critics in Congress called for his resignation or impeachment. His own party was divided. Some Republicans thought the war had been a mistake and should be ended on any terms available. Madison's health suffered under the relentless stress. The bilious attacks returned with new frequency and severity. He lost weight, appeared haggard and exhausted in public, seemed overwhelmed by the cascade of military defeats and political attacks. The crisis came in the summer of 1814. British armies, freed from fighting Napoleon in Europe, crossed the Atlantic in force. In August, a British army landed in Maryland, marched on Washington, and found the capital virtually undefended. Madison, attempting to function as commander-in-chief, rode out to observe American militia forces preparing to defend the city. What he saw was chaos. The militia broke and ran before the British even attacked. Madison himself had to flee, galloping away from the advancing British troops, the only president to come under enemy fire while in office. The British entered Washington and burned the public buildings. The Capitol, the President's House, the Treasury, all went up in flames. Madison and Dolly, who had bravely remained at the President's house until the last moment, saving George Washington's portrait before fleeing, were reduced to camping in Virginia while the Capitol smouldered. It was the low point of Madison's presidency, perhaps the low point of his life. The city he had helped to plan, the government he had designed, lay in ruins. He was widely blamed for the disaster. Critics called for his resignation. The war seemed lost. But then, unexpectedly, the tide turned. In September 1814, an American naval victory on Lake Champlain stopped a British invasion from Canada. In January 1815, Andrew Jackson won a stunning victory at New Orleans, killing over 2,000 British soldiers while losing fewer than 100 Americans. The victory came after a peace treaty had already been signed in Europe, but Americans did not know that. What they knew was that Jackson had crushed a British army, vindicating American honour. The Treaty of Ghent, signed on Christmas Eve 1814, ended the war without resolving the issues that had caused it. Britain made no concessions on impressment or neutral rights. No territory changed hands. By any objective measure, the war was a draw, perhaps even an American defeat. But Americans did not see it that way. They remembered Jackson's victory and forgot the disasters. They convinced themselves that they had won a second war of independence, that they had proved they could stand up to Britain and survive. Madison's presidency was saved by this wave of patriotic enthusiasm. The Federalist Party, tainted by its opposition to the war, collapsed and soon disappeared. Madison's last 2 years in office, from 1815 to 1817, were relatively peaceful and successful. He supported a new national bank, protective tariffs, and internal improvements, measures he had once opposed as Hamiltonian, but now accepted as necessary for national strength. The war had changed him, or perhaps revealed that the strict constructionism of his earlier years had always been tempered by pragmatic recognition of national needs. In March 1817, James Madison left the presidency and returned to Montpelier. He was 65 years old, exhausted by 8 difficult years, ready for retirement. He had survived the burning of Washington, the near loss of the war, and fierce political attacks. He left office more respected than when he had entered it, though still controversial. His presidency had not been a glorious success, but he had guided the nation through its most dangerous foreign crisis and preserved the republic he had helped to found. And now, finally, he could go home to Virginia, to his books and his plantation, to the life of a gentleman farmer and elder statesman. He thought his public career was over. He did not know that he still had 19 years ahead of him, years that would establish his final role as the sage of Montpelier, the last surviving founder, the memory of a revolutionary generation. The last 19 years of James Madison's life were spent almost entirely at Montpelier, the plantation he had inherited from his father and which he had expanded and improved over the decades. The main house had been enlarged, transformed from the modest structure of his childhood into an elegant mansion with tall white columns, a portico looking out over the Virginia Piedmont, and rooms filled with books, maps, and the accumulated papers of a long political life. Madison rose each day according to a fixed routine, the kind of disciplined schedule he had maintained since his Princeton days. He was an early riser, usually awake by dawn or slightly before. The first hour of the day he spent in private reading and reflection, often religious texts or philosophical works. Though he rarely attended church in his later years, Madison maintained a personal faith that was private and undogmatic. He believed in a creator but rejected sectarian dogma and insisted on separation of church and state as a fundamental American principle. Breakfast was taken around 8 o'clock, usually simple fare, bread, fruit, coffee or tea. Dolly presided over the breakfast table when guests were present, but in private the couple ate simply. Madison was never a heavy eater. His small frame and frequent digestive troubles meant he ate sparingly throughout his life. He avoided rich foods, preferred vegetables and fruits to meat, and drank wine in moderation. After breakfast came the morning's main work. Madison would retreat to his library, a room lined floor to ceiling with thousands of books in several languages. The library contained classical texts in Latin and Greek, histories and political theory in English and French, agricultural manuals, scientific works, legal treatises, and complete runs of newspapers and journals from America and Europe. Madison read constantly and voraciously. History, philosophy, agriculture, politics, theology, science. There was no subject that failed to interest him. He kept up with developments in America and Europe through an extensive correspondence and through newspapers and journals that arrived regularly from Richmond, Washington, Philadelphia, and even from London and Paris. He would spend hours each morning reading the latest newspapers, marking articles of interest, clipping items to save or share with correspondents. He read everything he could about the political developments in Europe, the revolutions and reformations that were sweeping the continent in the 1820s and 1830s. His eyesight remained remarkably sharp until his very last years. He did not need spectacles for reading until he was past 80. His mind remained equally clear, able to recall details from decades earlier, to quote lengthy passages from memory, to engage in complex philosophical arguments. Visitors marvelled at his mental acuity in old age. He seemed to have forgotten nothing, to have read everything. The late morning and early afternoon were devoted to correspondence. Madison wrote dozens of letters each week, maintaining contact with old friends, advising younger politicians who sought his counsel, answering inquiries about constitutional questions, and corresponding with scholars who were writing about the founding era. His handwriting, once neat and precise, became increasingly cramped and difficult to read as rheumatism twisted his fingers. By the 1830s, he sometimes needed Dolly or a secretary to take dictation when his hands were too painful to hold a pen. After breakfast, he would attend to plantation business, though increasingly this fell to overseers. Montpelier was a working plantation of about 5,000 acres, worked by about 100 enslaved people. The plantation grew tobacco, though Madison was trying to shift to wheat and corn, which were less exhausting to the soil. It raised livestock, sheep for wool, cattle for milk and meat, horses for transport and farm work. It maintained orchards, vegetable gardens, and various craft shops where enslaved workers produced tools, barrels, cloth, and other necessities. Like all Virginia plantations, Montpelier was struggling economically. Tobacco had exhausted the soil over generations of cultivation. Prices for agricultural products were low and unpredictable. Madison was burdened with debt, partly inherited from his father, partly accumulated through years of public service when his salary did not cover his expenses. He tried various agricultural reforms, crop rotation, new fertilizers, improved ploughing techniques, but nothing could reverse the fundamental problem of worn-out land and a slave labor system that was becoming increasingly unprofitable. Madison's relationship to slavery remained the great contradiction of his life. He understood that it was wrong, intellectually, morally, and politically. He wrote about its evils in letters and essays. He described it as a moral and political evil that threatened the Republic. He privately supported gradual emancipation and colonization of freed slaves to Africa, believing that whites and free blacks could not live together peacefully in the same society, a racist assumption that most white Americans of his era shared. But he never freed his own slaves, not even in his will. He depended on their labor for his livelihood and for Dolly's support after his death. He claimed to lack the financial resources to emancipate them and provide for their welfare, as Virginia law technically required, though the requirement was rarely enforced. He worried that freeing his slaves would impoverish Dolly, and that freed slaves would suffer without the protection of a master. These were rationalizations, ways of avoiding the fundamental choice between principle and property, and Madison knew it. When Madison died, his slaves were indeed sold to pay his debts, though Dolly worked to keep families together and to find buyers who would treat them humanely. Some Madison family slaves ended up in the Deep South, sold away from their families. It was a cruel irony that the man who had written about human liberty and human dignity left dozens of human beings in bondage and contributed to their sale and separation. This was the tragedy of the founding generation, or at least of its Virginia representatives. They built a republic on principles of liberty and equality, while maintaining a system of slavery that violated those principles absolutely. Madison knew this. He wrote about it. He worried about it. In his later years, he became increasingly pessimistic about the possibility of resolving the slavery question peacefully. He predicted that it would lead to crisis and perhaps to the Union's dissolution. But he never resolved it personally, never took the step of freeing his own slaves and accepting the economic consequences. He remains, in this respect, a man of his time and place, unable or unwilling to transcend the economic and social system that shaped and sustained him. But visitors to Montpelier in these years found not a troubled slaveholder, but a gracious host and brilliant conversationalist. Madison and Dolly entertained constantly, almost daily during the summer and fall when Virginia's weather was pleasant and travel was easy. Friends and family visited for extended stays. Political allies came to consult with the last surviving founder. Foreign travellers on the American Grand Tour made pilgrimages to Montpelier to meet the father of the Constitution. Dolly presided over these gatherings with warmth, elegance, and genuine hospitality. She remembered everyone's names, asked about their families, made guests feel welcome and valued. She managed a household that sometimes included a dozen or more visitors along with family members. She supervised meals, arranged accommodations, organized entertainments, and did it all with apparent effortlessness, though she was working constantly behind the scenes to make everything run smoothly. Madison, in small groups where he was comfortable, proved to be a wonderful storyteller, full of anecdotes about the founding era, the Constitutional Convention, the great figures he had known. He would talk about Washington, Jefferson, Hamilton, Franklin, bringing them to life for listeners who had only read about these giants. He described the debates at the Constitutional Convention, the compromises that had been struck, the personalities and conflicts that had shaped the document. He explained the thinking behind various constitutional provisions, what problems they had been designed to solve, what alternatives had been considered and rejected. But he was careful in what he said, especially about controversial topics. He defended the Constitution and the Union. He insisted that the Constitution had created a national government, not a mere confederation of sovereign states. But he also insisted that it had left significant powers to the states, and that federal power was limited by enumerated grants. He tried to position himself above the increasingly bitter partisan debates that were tearing at the nation, but his sympathies were clearly with those who defended federal authority against state nullification. He was working on a project that he knew would be his final contribution to history. He was editing his notes from the Constitutional Convention, the most complete record of what had been said and decided during those crucial months in 1787. Madison had taken these notes in shorthand during the debates, then written them out each evening. He had kept them secret for decades, knowing they would be valuable to future generations trying to understand the Constitution's origins. Now, in retirement, he revised and polished these notes, adding context, correcting errors, preparing them for publication after his death. He wanted future Americans to understand what the framers had intended, what problems they had tried to solve, what compromises they had accepted. He knew that debates over the Constitution's meaning would continue long after he was gone, and he wanted his notes to serve as a guide. As the years passed, Madison became increasingly famous as the last survivor of the founding generation. Jefferson died in 1826 on July 4th, 50 years to the day after the Declaration of Independence. John Adams died the same day. His last words reportedly, "Jefferson still lives," not knowing his old friend and rival had preceded him by a few hours. James Monroe died in 1831. Madison was now the last of the presidents who had served in the Revolution, the last who had helped write the Constitution, the final living link to 1787. Visitors came to Montpelier as if on pilgrimage, seeking the wisdom of the last founder. Madison received them graciously, answered their questions, and shared his memories. But he was careful in what he said. He defended the Constitution and the Union. He insisted that the Constitution had created a national government, not a mere confederation, but also that it had left states with significant powers. He tried to position himself above the partisan debates that were tearing at the nation. For the crisis that Madison had helped to create through the Virginia resolutions was now threatening to destroy the Union. Southern states, led by South Carolina, were claiming the right to nullify federal laws they considered unconstitutional, particularly the protective tariff. They cited the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions as precedent. Madison was horrified. He had never intended to justify nullification or secession. He wrote letters and essays explaining that his resolutions had been protests, not claims of state sovereignty superior to federal law, but his clarifications had little effect. The nullification crisis of 1832 to 1833 was resolved through compromise, but the underlying tensions remained. The question of federal versus state power, the question Madison thought the Constitution had settled, was still unsettled. And beneath it lay the question of slavery, which was becoming the defining issue of American politics. Madison knew that slavery threatened the Union, but he had no solution. He clung to the hope that gradual emancipation and colonization might work, but this was fantasy, not policy. As Madison aged into his 80s, his body began to fail, though his mind remained clear. He suffered from rheumatism, making movement painful. His hands became so crippled he could barely write. He lost weight, becoming almost skeletal in his final years. But visitors continued to come, and he continued to receive them when he had the strength. He watched the nation change around him. Andrew Jackson's presidency transformed American politics, bringing mass democracy and partisan conflict to new levels. Internal improvements, the railroads and canals, were knitting the nation together. The population was exploding westward. America was becoming something the founders had not quite imagined. A continental empire, a democratic mass society, a nation where the common people, not just the educated elite, would shape politics. Madison approved of some of these changes and worried about others. He had always believed in Republican government by the people, but he had also believed in filters and checks, in educated representatives who could resist temporary passions. The new democracy was rawer, less filtered, more responsive to popular emotions. He was not sure it was an improvement. As 1836 approached, Madison knew he did not have much time left. He was 85 years old, an extraordinary age for his era when most men did not live past 60. His body was failing rapidly in ways that could no longer be ignored or managed. The rheumatism that had troubled him for years had worsened dramatically, twisting his hands into claws and making walking without assistance impossible. His legs would no longer support his weight. He spent increasing amounts of time in bed or in a specially designed chair that supported his failing body. He could barely feed himself, his twisted fingers unable to manipulate utensils properly. Servants had to cut his food into small pieces, and even then he struggled to eat. He had always been small and thin, but now he became almost skeletal, his weight dropping below 90 pounds, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that seemed to be dissolving. His face, always thin, became gaunt, the bones standing out sharply beneath pale skin. Yet remarkably, his mind remained sharp to the very end. Visitors in his final months reported that his memory was unimpaired, his ability to converse on complex topics undiminished. He could still quote lengthy passages from the classics, could still analyze constitutional questions with precision, could still tell stories from the founding era with perfect clarity. Only his body was failing. The mind that had shaped the Constitution remained active until the last. He knew he was dying, and he faced death with the same calm rationality he had brought to every other challenge in his life. He made provisions for Dolly's welfare, though he knew his estate would not be sufficient to provide for her comfortably. He organised his papers, particularly his notes from the Constitutional Convention, which he knew would be valuable both historically and financially. He wrote final letters to old friends, saying goodbye with dignity and without undue emotion. In June 1836, his condition worsened noticeably. He could no longer eat solid food at all, surviving on thin soups and liquids. His speech became difficult, words coming slowly and with effort, but he remained conscious, aware, able to recognise family members and understand what was happening around him. Dolly was constantly at his bedside now, along with his niece Nellie Willis, and a few trusted servants who had cared for him for years. The doctor visited daily but could do nothing. There was no specific illness, no acute crisis, just the general collapse of a body that had endured 85 years of use. Madison did not complain. He had never been one to dwell on his physical ailments, despite their frequency throughout his life. He accepted what was happening with the stoicism of a man who had long expected death, and who was satisfied with what he had accomplished. On the morning of June 28, 1836, a servant brought Madison his breakfast, a thin gruel that he might be able to swallow. The servant later reported that Madison seemed unable to swallow even this, that he appeared to be struggling, though he made no sound of distress. Dolly, who had spent the night in a chair beside his bed, asked him what was wrong, if he was in pain, if he needed anything. Madison didn't answer. He simply looked at her for a long moment, his expression calm, perhaps even peaceful. Then his head fell forward onto his chest. His breathing, which had been shallow and laboured, stopped. There was no struggle, no dramatic last moment, no final words. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, the fourth President of the United States, the last surviving member of the Constitutional Convention, was gone. It was a peaceful death, as deaths go, the kind of quiet departure that Madison himself might have written if given the choice. He had not suffered prolonged agony or lost his mental faculties to senility. He had died at home, in his own bed, surrounded by people who loved him. He was 85 years old, and he had lived to see the nation he helped create survive its first 50 years and grow from 13 fragile states clinging to the Atlantic coast to 25 states stretching halfway across the continent. But he left behind unresolved tensions, the question of slavery, the question of state versus federal power, the question of whether the union he'd worked so hard to create could endure. These questions would dominate American politics for the next quarter century, and they would be answered not through constitutional debate but through civil war. The funeral was held at Montpelier on June 30th, 1836. Several hundred people attended, neighbours, family, political allies. The service was simple, Protestant but not overtly sectarian, befitting a man who had championed religious liberty and private faith over established churches. Madison was buried in the family cemetery at Montpelier, in a plot overlooking the estate he had loved. Dolly lived another 13 years, dying in 1849 at age 81. She spent much of that time in Washington, where she was celebrated as the last link to the founding era. She sold Madison's papers, including his notes from the Constitutional Convention, to the federal government, providing herself with income and ensuring that her husband's most important work would be preserved for future generations. The notes from the Constitutional Convention were published in 1840, 4 years after Madison's death. They immediately became essential to understanding the Constitution's origins and the framers' intent. Scholars, judges, and politicians have relied on them ever since, trying to determine what Madison and his colleagues meant by specific phrases and provisions. The notes are Madison's final gift to the American people, a window into the debates that shaped the nation's fundamental law. James Madison's legacy is complex and contested, as is fitting for a man who lived through revolutionary transformation and helped create institutions that would outlast him by centuries. He was the father of the Constitution, though that title simplifies a process that involved many hands and many compromises. He was the primary architect of the Bill of Rights, though he initially thought it unnecessary. He was a great political theorist whose Federalist essays remain essential reading for understanding American government. He was a president who led the nation through a difficult war and preserved the Union against external threats. But he was also a slaveholder who never freed his slaves, a man who built freedom on bondage and never resolved the contradiction. He was a strict constructionist who abandoned strict construction when it proved impractical. He was a defender of states' rights whose Virginia resolutions contributed to theories of nullification and secession that nearly destroyed the Union he cherished. His legacy, like the man himself, is marked by paradox and unresolved tensions. What remains most powerfully is the Constitution itself, the document Madison did more than any other single person to create, defend, and explain. That Constitution, with its system of checks and balances, its separation of powers, its protection of individual rights, its mechanisms for amendment and adaptation, has endured for more than 2 centuries. It has survived civil war, economic catastrophe, social transformation, and political crisis. It remains the framework of American government, the foundation of American law, the touchstone of American political debate. Every time we argue about the proper scope of federal power, we're arguing about questions Madison grappled with. Every time we invoke the First Amendment or the other provisions of the Bill of Rights, we are relying on protections Madison drafted. Every time we debate the Constitution's meaning, we are continuing conversations that began in Philadelphia in 1787, with Madison as one of the primary voices. Walk into the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and you will see the Constitution under glass, protected and revered. The handwriting is mostly that of Gouverneur Morris, who chaired the Committee of Style, but the ideas, the structure, the careful balancing of competing interests and values, those bear Madison's stamp more than anyone else's. We the people begins the document, asserting popular sovereignty, but the more perfect union that follows is Madison's creation, the product of his reading, his thinking, his political skill, and his willingness to compromise without abandoning principle. In the rotunda of the University of Virginia, founded by Thomas Jefferson but supported throughout by Madison, there is a statue of Madison seated, a book in his lap, his eyes gazing towards something beyond the viewer. It captures something essential about the man. He was never the most charismatic founder, never the most eloquent, never the most physically imposing. But he was perhaps the deepest thinker, the most systematic, the most able to translate political philosophy into constitutional structure. His life spanned the entire revolutionary generation, from British colonies to established republic, from 13 states clinging to the Atlantic coast to a nation stretching toward the Mississippi and beyond. He was born a subject of King George II and died a citizen of a democratic republic of his own making. That transformation, from monarchy to republic, from colony to nation, was the work of many hands, but Madison's hands were among the most important. The historian Gordon Wood wrote that Madison was the most profound and most original thinker of his generation. The legal scholar Akila Ma called him history's most successful political scientist. These are high praises, but they are justified. Madison took the questions that every society must answer: who should rule, How should power be distributed? How can liberty and order be balanced? And he worked out answers that have proven durable and adaptable across centuries. He was not a perfect man. He owned slaves. He made political calculations that put expediency above principle. He sometimes allowed partisan loyalty to cloud his judgment. He was not always the fierce defender of civil liberties his rhetoric suggested, the Alien and Sedition Acts crisis being his finest hour, but other moments revealing a more cautious approach to dissent. He lived long enough to see some of his ideas vindicated and others called into question. But the Constitution endures. The Bill of Rights protects. The system of separated powers continues to check ambition with ambition. And every generation of Americans inherits the government that James Madison, more than any other founder, designed. If you have stayed with this journey through James Madison's life, thank you. If you found value in this exploration of one of America's most important but least celebrated founders, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I would love to know in the comments what aspect of Madison's life and thought resonated most with you, or what questions his legacy raises for you. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night. James Madison lies in the family cemetery at Montpelier, in the Virginia soil he loved, surrounded by the land his family worked and the people they enslaved. The estate is now a museum, preserved so that future generations can walk where Madison walked, can see the library where he read and thought, can stand on the portico where he received visitors and discussed the fate of the Republic. The Constitution he helped write survives him by 236 years and counting. The questions he grappled with, how to balance liberty and order, how to prevent tyranny while maintaining effective government, how to protect individual rights while preserving the common good, these questions remain as urgent today as they were in 1787. Madison's final message is perhaps this: government is a human creation, imperfect and always improvable, but capable through careful design of protecting liberty and promoting the general welfare. The work of building and maintaining free government is never finished. Each generation must interpret the Constitution for its own time, must balance competing values, must work out in practice what the framers laid down in principle. The small, sickly student from Orange County, Virginia, the man who spoke so softly that audiences strained to hear him, the thinker who preferred books to crowds and careful writing to public oratory, that man shaped American government more profoundly than any general or any president. His monument is not marble or bronze. His monument is the government he designed, the rights he protected, the union he preserved. As long as the Constitution endures, James Madison's influence endures. As long as Americans debate the meaning of their fundamental law, they will be debating questions that Madison first posed and first attempted to answer. Good night.